Composition for photographers, the strongest way of seeing. What is composition? Composition equals order. It's about how we decide where things belong in our pictures and how we organize what appears in the frame into a pleasing arrangement. By understanding composition, you can help your viewers understand what you want them to see. Here we'll show you a few simple rules and techniques you can learn to quickly make your pictures look better. So before we go forward, let me just mention that that we call these rules, but they're not really rules, they're guidelines. Once you learn how to look at a picture and talk about them in the terms that we're about to show you, you can start to figure out how to modify these guidelines and in some cases even break the guidelines. So I don't want you to think that this is a kind of a hard and fast way to understand composition. It's simply learning the basic guidelines that we all learn at the beginning, and then from there you'll make these techniques your own by modifying them. Okay, so let's go forward. The first thing to talk about is the rule of thirds, and the rule of thirds is probably the most basic and important rule of composition. It shows you where to place important parts of the scene by imagining your picture as if it was divided into thirds, both up and down and side to side. And if you look at it like this, we have a grid. So the gray rectangle represents the frame that you see when you look through your camera. And the yellow lines represent imaginary divisions in the frame that set up what we call the rule of thirds. So the lines themselves, as well as the intersection of the lines, become clues to where you can easily organize elements of your pictures to make your photographs appear to be a little more organized. Okay, so the lines themselves as well as the intersections. So let's lay this grid over some photographs and show you how it works. So in this picture, it's a fairly formal composition, and you can see that the bottom third, the horizontal line that runs across the bottom third of the picture, lines up generally with what you would think of as the horizon line in the picture. Now, the actual horizon obviously is hidden by the bridge, but you can assume and you can guess that that's where the horizon line would be, along that lower third. The tall building in the background, which is actually the subject of the picture, appears to fall along the left side vertical line. And everything else just kind of fits neatly into this grid. Now this isn't a mathematical thing, it's not perfect, but you can see that it does kind of fall under the basic outline of that these lines form. This picture also works in a similar fashion. The horizon line is not perfect, but it's higher in the frame, and it falls close to where the horizontal line at the top of the frame is. The main part of the picture obviously is the pier, but maybe the subject of the picture is the Ferris wheel in the back, and you can see that that falls near the intersection of the top horizontal line and the left side vertical line. Once again, it's not perfect, but you can see how the organization kind of works in thirds. This one's a little bit simpler to see. You can see that actually on the upper horizontal line and the left side vertical line, you can see how they almost perfectly form along the column that's holding the building up. And the two dark columns on the right and the left kind of frame the picture along this very rough kind of rule of thirds. The idea is what we're trying to do really when you follow the rule of thirds, you're trying to avoid putting anything important in the center of the picture. So a lot of amateur photographers will automatically center the subject of their photograph right in the very middle of the frame, and it creates very boring and repetitive pictures. So the rule of thirds just tries to show you how to avoid or move away from the center of the frame. Same thing here, you're starting to see the pattern. Here the horizon line is low, and the main part of the picture is the old sign that's in the upper right-hand corner, and you can see that it falls underneath the intersection of the top horizontal line and the right side vertical line. Another one. Now this is starting to get a little trickier, because remember I said just a few slides ago how we like to show students how to avoid the center of the frame. But in a picture like this, obviously the main part of the picture, or the two main parts of the picture, are the sign in the very middle that says "Standing in aisles not permitted," and then the foot that's hanging over the side. This is at Fenway Park in Boston, the baseball stadium. And for this picture, obviously, we're starting to play around with maybe reinterpreting the rule of thirds here. And while the foot and the leg are in the upper right third of the picture, obviously the sign is right in the middle. This kind of picture proves that you can break the rule of thirds if you'd like, as long as you're doing it intentionally. The idea is to not let things happen unintentionally. You're intentionally organizing the frame when you use these compositional guidelines. Here's a square picture, and a square picture has different compositional properties than rectangular pictures. But once again, very formal composition, low horizon line, and then you have the strong column on the lower right that falls along the right side vertical line. Okay, now the rule of thirds isn't just about the things we just talked about with horizon lines and landscape pictures, the way we showed you. If you want to think about landscapes a little bit differently, and this really kind of emphasizes some of the things we talked about in a few of the pictures before, but if you really want to look at how landscape photographers use the rule of thirds, we think once again strongly about the horizon line. Where you place the horizon line helps show the viewer what you want them to look at first. Okay, so if you place it along the top third of the picture, what you actually do is you emphasize the foreground or the bottom of the picture. If you place the horizon line along the bottom of the picture, what you're really doing is emphasizing the sky or the top of the picture or the background. But if you place the horizon line directly across the middle of the picture, you're really emphasizing both or neither. And if you're emphasizing neither, what you're doing, what most people do accidentally, is it results in a boring or a confusing picture. So here's the same picture cropped in three different ways just to show you what we're talking about. So the first picture, the horizon line is placed high in the frame. It's not perfectly across the top third of the frame here, but you get the idea. It's raised above the center line. And by doing so, what it does, this picture is a little more intimate because it forces your attention down. So it forces your attention into the road that's in the bottom of the picture, and the road kind of guides you into the rest of the picture. But the emphasis on this picture with the high horizon line forces the viewer to kind of look to the bottom of the frame first. Now in this next picture, it's the same shot cropped differently. Here's what happens when you put the horizon line lower. Suddenly the picture looks a lot more distant, and the emphasis is on the sky, and it's not as intimate an image as the previous one. And if you place the horizon line right in the center, the picture is really about both. You see the sky, you see the foreground. It's not that this is a particularly bad picture, but we're not really emphasizing one over the other. It's just both the sky and the foreground take equal prominence in this picture. And it all comes from where you place that horizon line. Now, also along the same lines with the rule of third, the same principles that we apply to previous pictures can apply to other types of pictures as well. For instance, portrait photographers try to place their subject's eyes toward the top third of the frame in a traditional portrait, a traditional studio portrait. And architectural photographers often place the horizon line low to emphasize the height and the strength of the buildings that they're photographing. So here's an example of what portrait photographers often do. This is a typical framing and composition for a photo shot of a model. The eyes are high in the frame. But that's the same rule of thirds grid just applied to a vertical frame. Another example, a more traditional portrait. The eyes are in the top third of the picture along that intersection of the top horizontal line and the two vertical lines. Here's an architectural photograph. The camera angle is low, the horizon line is low, and it emphasizes the verticality, the height of the building. Even though this is a long, flat building, the sign is much taller, and this low horizon line and low camera angle really emphasize the height of that sign. Same thing here with a square picture once again. Two main elements in this picture, the old tree, the dead tree on the right side, which falls along the right vertical line, and also the church, which falls along the intersection of the horizontal line and then the two. It falls between the intersection of the horizontal line at the bottom and the two vertical lines. All based on the rule of thirds. And like I said, this is not math, but it is a general sense of how we think of using this guideline to organize the information in the frame. Same thing here, a very simple picture. Lines up almost perfectly. The horizon line is across the bottom third of the picture. The emphasis then is on the sky. Same thing here, low horizon line, strong building. So let's move on to the next topic here. This is called positive and negative space. Now, positive space refers to the subject of the picture. Negative space refers to everything else that appears in the frame. Now, the negative space that's around the subject of the picture is especially important. What surrounds the actual subject or the reason for taking the picture is extremely important. So you should always pay attention to how the subject of your photograph interacts with the space around it. It's a great example of positive and negative space. So this is a famous photographer by the name of Clint Clemens giving a presentation. And Clint is standing in front of a bright projection screen. And the light coming off of the screen is silhouetting him to a great extent. And all of that bright, kind of flat tone behind him is perfectly defining the shape of this person. And while it's not a complete silhouette, it's enough of a silhouette that you just get a really strong sense of what he looks like and the contours of his face and the gesture that he's making with his hands. It's all defined by this very simple negative space. So the positive space in this picture is Clint. The negative space in this picture is everything else, which in this particular case is just the white or light gray background. In this picture, once again, there's a lot more to look at. It's a lot more complicated information in the picture, but obviously the subject in the picture is the photographer in front of this beautiful old church near Taos, New Mexico. But because there's so little detail in this picture other than the photographer, all of that additional stuff that's around the edges, the shapes and the different tonalities and light and the shadows, are all considered negative space for this shot. And because the negative space is so simple and the frame is so cleanly designed here, you look at the photographer in the picture kind of first before you look at all the other stuff. But the other stuff just kind of supports the strength of the picture. And you can even see a little bit of the rule of thirds at work here. This is a reflection, and this is something that photographers do to trick all of you. You wonder how a picture like this is taken. Well, it's easy. This is a picture of a reflection of a building and a lobster boat. And what you do is you crop out the actual building, the actual lobster boat, and you flip the picture of the reflection upside down. And suddenly it looks like kind of an eerie seascape picture, but it's really not. It's just a reflection. So the negative space here is the water and the beautiful gradient in the water where it goes from very dark in the upper left corner to it starts to kind of grade off into gray, and that gray tone around the subject of the picture really helps to define the edges and the shape of the buildings that we want you to look at. Interesting picture here. The subject of the picture appears to be this gentleman standing on the street, but he's pointing at the negative space. Now, he's pointing at what he believes to be a UFO, an unidentified flying object. He believes that aliens from outer space are invading planet Earth, and he always walks up and down the street showing people the UFOs up in the sky. Another very formal composition. The negative space is that flat tone in the sky, and it perfectly silhouettes and isolates the more complicated the shape of the Christmas tree lights or the Christmas lights that are hanging above the street, and also this very interesting building. And so there's not a lot of stuff to look at here, but everything is very formally arranged. And the negative space, or the sky in this particular case, really helps to show you what the shape and the character of all the different objects in this picture are. It's really, this is really fairly simple stuff. And two more pictures. These I just photographed just a week ago. This is on a beach in Florida. And the little sparkly, glittery things that look like stars are actually just reflections of the sun in a thin layer of water on the beach. So the subject of the picture, the positive space, appears to be the shell, but the negative space is really the powerful part of this picture, of both of these pictures. So more about positive and negative space. Furthermore, our eyes and brains interpret brighter parts of a picture as being more important than darker parts. We also see areas of a picture that are in sharp focus as being more important than parts of the picture that are out of focus. And when you understand all of this, it enables you to direct your viewer to the parts of the picture that you want them to see first. All right, so let's look at the brighter and darker aspect of this first. So in this picture, very, very complicated scene, a lot of very delicate detail in this forest scene, but because of the tone or the brightness of the surrounding forest, the trees and the canopy of leaves is so much darker than the path and the person that's walking along the path, the first thing that you see when you glance at this picture is you see the person on the path. Even though the person is such a small part of this picture because she's brighter and because she is walking along what we call a leading line, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the line of that path actually creates almost an arrow that helps you see what it is the photographer wants you to see. So in this particular case, the darker part of the picture recedes in importance, and the brightest part of the picture becomes the most important. It's just the way our eyes and our brains work. In this picture, another very simple picture, the positive space, or the subject, I suppose, of the picture, is the gray column on the right. Now you can, by this point, you should start to see the rule of thirds. When you start to look at these pictures, you'll see that the rule of thirds is a basic thing that's happening in all these pictures. But there's other things that happen in good pictures as well. And not to say that this is a great picture, but it's an interesting picture because of the way the bright column separates and comes forward from the dark chipped paint wall behind it. And the fact that that wall is also darker and out of focus makes the subject of this picture fairly obvious, once again, because your eyes and your brain respond to the brightest part of the scene, and the sharpest part of the scene is the most important part of the scene. Now we'll talk about leading lines. Leading lines in a photograph create a visual path for your viewer to follow. Used properly, they guide the viewer into the picture and direct her attention to important aspects of the composition. Lines that start in the corner of the frame are particularly effective. Examples of common leading lines are a road or a path, a river, shadows, that kind of thing. So in this photograph, this is taken at the Grand Canyon. This is a famous observation tower at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The leading line, this is a classic leading line, the spiral shape that kind of starts in the lower left corner and brings your eye around the picture the same way that you would walk from the top of this tower to the bottom of the tower. So you follow the line of the staircase and the landing at the bottom of the stairs the same way you would follow it physically. This picture is a little more complicated because the leading line really kind of doesn't lead you where you expect it to. It doesn't lead you into the picture, it actually leads you out of the picture. The arrow, the bright white arrow in the bottom, is the most attention-getting part of this picture, but it points outside of the frame. Now, someone also pointed out that the line of snow that's kind of in the center of the frame to the right also kind of acts as like a secondary leading line and kind of directs us back into what may be the subject of the picture. This isn't a particularly strong photograph, but it does show how when you lead people's attention or you lead your viewer's attention outside of the frame, it kind of leaves you with a bit of an unsettled feeling, and it doesn't feel like the picture doesn't feel very peaceful. It feels a little more tense when you direct the viewer toward the edge of the frame. Simple picture taken at Death Valley in California, just a path through this spectacular landscape, but the path leads your eye through the picture the same way that the path would lead you through the landscape physically. The railroad tracks in this photograph actually lead you directly toward the subject of the picture, which is the building, the tall building. This appeared in another photograph earlier on, just a different angle. A little bit different use of leading lines here. The subject of this photograph was a man playing the accordion on the Paris Metro, and the train was moving, and the lines, the strong diagonal lines you see in this picture that direct your attention toward the man with the accordion, those lines were actually lights in the subway tunnel outside the train, and all of it kind of combined to create this very dynamic image of kind of an anonymous person in a subway train. So those lines also help direct your attention, and as well as directing your attention to the subject of the picture, they also tend to add a dynamism to this picture. Diagonal lines are very strong elements in a composition and imply movement and kind of dynamic energy. This picture is all about lines. It's two buildings that appear to be connected that actually aren't connected in real space. So the way the lines in the small building at the bottom connect with the lines in the much taller building in the back, this is an intentional effort on the photographer's part to actually create what we call tangents, and this is where you do use lines in buildings that are not, or parts of a photograph that aren't physically attached, but by making the lines connect with each other, you actually, in two-dimensional space, you're actually making it appear that they're actually connected. So once again, just an exercise in how to use lines, and leading lines in this case. And this is a classic landscape picture using leading lines. The point of the photograph is apparently the bridge, but really the point of the photograph is along the horizon line on the very left of the frame. You see the glow of a small town. That's Sedona, Arizona. And the point of this photograph is to take you visually across the bridge and down the winding road that runs above the creek in the canyon below, and eventually wind up at this beautiful village in Arizona. So you basically take the same trip in this photograph that you would take in your car. You would go across the bridge and you follow the road, and eventually you wind up in the bright city at sunset. Kind of an architectural photograph here looking at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., and the escalator coming up from the metro in Washington that deposits you right at the front door of the National Building Museum. The leading line of the railing for the escalator and the steps of the escalator, and even the little receding round bumps that are on the flat surface to the left, all kind of direct your attention up at the building. A strong angle on the building, as well as this interesting use of lines to kind of get you to the front door of the building visually. So the next thing we'll talk about here is pattern. And visual interest in a photograph can be created simply by emphasizing repetitive features like shapes or colors. So you should start to become aware of how often similar geometric shapes like circles, triangles, or rectangles appear in the frame. Random repetitive color suggests relationships in the frame that wouldn't occur otherwise. And an awareness of patterns even helps a photographer see similarities, which are actually patterns, between different photographs. So once you start to see patterns in an individual photograph, or use patterns in an individual photograph, you can start to see the same kind of pattern phenomenon occur between pictures that aren't otherwise connected to each other. For instance, this photograph has an awful lot of rectangular shapes. And the rectangular shapes, the dark rectangles in this picture, simply become the pattern that is the underlying reason why the photograph was made. The recognition of the pattern of these shapes. You see the rule of thirds at work as well. Probably one of the best examples of patterns I've ever personally photographed is this one, and the patterns of the squares and rectangles in the window behind this guy, and the pattern of the stripes and squares on his shirt, all perfectly aligned. A very lucky coincidence, but it took a long time to wait for just the right person to come into just the right spot to actually get this photograph. So remember this: the harder you work, the luckier you get. The pattern here, it's kind of a funny picture, but one of the things that's so funny about it, obviously the person inside the truck appears to be a little different looking. But the thing that I like most about this picture is actually the crazy pattern of all the ice cream products that are kind of encircling the guy in the truck, and all of that pattern kind of it gives you an idea of the perhaps the quality of the product that this gentleman is selling. So there's a pattern in this picture as well. Here's a more organic pattern: ice over a frozen stream of water in the mountains. Just creates a very beautiful pattern. Very intentional photograph, very carefully positioned camera to create a pattern. Do you see the pattern in this picture? How many triangles do you see in this picture? Count the triangles. There are lots of them. The triangular shape of the tree in the upper left. Obviously the triangular shape of the teepees, which are actually motel rooms in a small town in Arizona. The triangular shape of the sky, the negative space around the teepees. You see triangles there. You even see triangles in the shape of the gaps in the steering wheel of the car. This picture is all about triangles. There's also a pattern in color with this picture: the color of the steering wheel, the color of the dashboard, the color of the sky, the color of the tinted glass, the green tree. There's a real kind of harmony with all of the shapes and the colors together in this photograph. This picture was taken in Amsterdam, and the two people walking down the street wearing identical red backpacks, there's a connection right there. a color connection. Now that's probably intentional. I'm assuming that these two gentlemen were part of a tour group and they received this backpack as one of the perks of their tour group. But also look at the color of the shirts. The purple stripes on the guy on the left side of the frame and the purple shirt on the right side of the frame. These color consistencies all make this picture kind of sit together, make all the elements of this picture sit together, whether they're intentional or unintentional. This was an example shot for a class, a lighting class, and completely unintentional, the color of the sweater that this young lady is wearing and the color of the paint on the above the window next to her, it's a perfect match. And so that green color helps to hold the picture together. The dramatic lighting obviously is a big part of this as well. The orange light inside the window there, and then the orange light in the building across the street. The blue color in the sky and kind of the blue-green tint in some of the paint on the window. Just a lot of color harmony here, and just that alone is enough to make your picture appear to be a little bit more finished, a little bit more professional looking, I suppose. It's easier to look at. It makes sense visually. Now this is where we talk about the pattern in the photograph. Obviously the things that are on the wall there that are creating that random pattern, that's actually the side wall of an art museum in Austin, Texas. So it's a designed pattern for this museum. But then this old car parked across the street with a stencil of a star on the roof of the car that's all weathered and kind of cracking, and it just makes an interesting photograph in and of itself. And pattern is one of the reasons why. But then when you see this picture and you start to think back about other pictures that you may have taken and perhaps responding to similar things that you see, and you realize that you're starting to see patterns in your own work. For instance, look at this picture, and then look at this picture that was taken many years earlier. And you see that star shape suddenly becomes a pattern that connect these two pictures there's no other reason to connect the two pictures. So imagine doing a collection of photographs that all had stars appearing in them, and suddenly that becomes the pattern that makes the pictures make sense when you see them side by side. So the next thing we'll talk about now is something called viewpoint. Now viewpoint means camera position. Where you choose to place the camera determines the point of view of the picture. Viewpoint controls how the subject interacts visually with other elements in the frame. Choosing an unusual viewpoint, either high or low, is often a simple way to make an extraordinary picture of an ordinary subject. For instance, there's a picture of a small dog, but with the camera down very close to the dog's eye level, suddenly the dog looks much bigger and much more present in the scene. And the person that's holding the dog's leash and the little baby in the carriage take a little bit more of a back seat in this picture, a little bit less prominence in the picture because the emphasis is on the dog because of the low camera angle and the close position of the camera to the dog. You're seeing things from the dog's point of view in a picture like this. In this picture in Iceland, waiting for a bus in Iceland, in Reykjavik, the camera was literally just placed on the sidewalk, so it wasn't even holding the camera in this photograph. The camera was placed on the sidewalk, and the timer was set to release the shutter without the photographer actually touching the shutter release. The camera was literally sitting on the sidewalk. It brings you down to the level of the subject of the picture. Instead of looking down at it, you're looking across at it. Very low camera angle photographing a simple street sign in Boston and a very tall building behind it. There's a lot of things at work here. Obviously the beautiful light, the very sharp contrasty sunlight reflecting off of the building, the low camera angle, the strong lines in the picture, the way the back of the sign reflects the sunlight, and also the sense of scale that we'll talk about when we talk about wide-angle lenses, what wide-angle lenses actually add to your sense of composition. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Low camera angle, this is in Delft, a small town in Holland, and fairly typical scene. Everybody rides bicycles in Europe, and you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bicycles always piled up along the sidewalk. But to make a different photograph, sometimes you have to put the camera in a different place from where everybody else shoots the picture. And just bringing the camera down a little bit lower, maybe trying to get a little bit of a reflection of the sun off of one of the windows, and suddenly you have something that's just a little bit different than what everybody else is looking at. Here's the opposite. This is a high camera angle. Looking down at the woman on the left who's on a playground swing, and she's swinging back and forth. and the woman on the right is laying on the ground, and she is photographing up. So she's getting the low angle of the woman on the swing, and I'm actually above them getting the high angle, shooting straight down. Just a different camera position, and it makes the picture a little bit more interesting simply because of it. Otherwise, it's kind of a simple photograph. Another high camera angle in one of the galleries at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. See the pattern? Now, point of view also refers to not necessarily the high or low vantage point, or the high or low camera position. It also, you can also think of point of view as doing something different with perhaps maybe shooting through something. And in this particular case, this is shooting through a wall of glass brick. Now, glass brick is a very thick and kind of imperfect material that creates a distorted view when you look through it. That's actually the point of the glass brick, is to kind of break up the clarity of what's inside or what's on the other side of the glass. And in this particular case, as people walked past this wall of glass brick, these very strange abstractions occurred. And I do this a lot. I like this. I like what happens. And you get the kind of the strange kind of impressionistic feeling in each one of the quadrants of this picture, but then you get the sharp lines of the mortar between the glass that kind of grounds the picture. There's a surface there. So you're obviously looking at something past the surface when you see the distortion on the other side. This is what we call a stakeout. It has everything to do with the camera position, because the idea behind this picture, and we like to talk about ideas, by the way, that part of composition is also concept. It's a different thing, but it actually it's the other side of the coin. It's not so much how you organize the information, but it's the idea behind your photographs. And the idea in this particular picture was to set up the camera in a way that highlighted these two old telephone booths on the street. Now, nobody uses telephone booths anymore. We all have mobile phones. So the two old telephone booths that have the graphic on the side of them kind of set those objects at a point in time. And the idea was I was going to wait there long enough for somebody to walk past with a cell phone and then create the contradiction between the old way of communicating and the new way of communicating. And part of the reason for picking this particular spot obviously was the light. You have that beautiful reflection off the glass. You have the pattern, the repetitive rectangular pattern of the window frame. You have the natural, we call this vignetting, where the edge of the frame is a little bit darker than the center of the frame, and that drives your attention toward the middle of the frame a little bit. And all I needed was the right person to walk past, and it took about a half hour. I sat there, my legs hurt a lot, kind of squatting down, waiting for just the right person to come past, and sure enough, eventually this guy came past. He's talking on his cell phone, and I just wait for him to hit the right part of the frame that I had already determined was where I wanted a person, and you push the button, and it's that simple. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of patience for these pictures to happen. But the camera position was critically important here to get those telephone booths and the icons, or the shapes on the side of the telephone booth to be the main content of this picture. And then you just wait for the person to show up that completes the picture. And this is a famous building by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. This is called Fallingwater. It's near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And where I made this photograph from is the spot that all of the tour guides say to take the picture from. So if you want to get the famous picture of Fallingwater, you stand in this spot and you take the same picture that every single other person in history has taken of this building. So being a photographer, of course, I wanted to take a picture of this building, but being a photographer that likes to try to do things a little bit differently, I didn't want to take the same picture that everybody else takes. So all I did was step back a little bit, and I take a picture of people taking a picture from the place that they're supposed to take the picture from. And suddenly the photograph becomes not so much a picture of falling water, but it becomes a picture about photographing falling water. And there's a big difference between a picture of things and a picture about things. And that's really what, when you really start to understand the power that you have as a photographer, that's when it starts to get interesting. This is a famous row of summer cottages on the tip of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And the vantage point here that made this different was this was in the middle of winter during a snowstorm, and not typically the types of pictures that people see of these particular buildings, because when you think of Cape Cod and you think of these cottages, you think of the summer. So to be out there in the middle of winter already creates a different point of view, and simply by photographing these small buildings through the snowy windshield of the car, you create a totally different impression of this building. And you can see that there's pattern at work here. We're breaking the rule of thirds a little bit with the centered horizon line. But the result of this is something different. It's not what most people photograph. And it's making an attempt to make a different, more interesting photograph of this very common scene. Here's a tricky one. This is actually, the photograph here is a puddle of water in the middle of the street. And the American flag that appears in the puddle of water is actually a reflection from a flag that's on a tall building across the street. And the flag is reflecting into the water, and the photograph is a picture of the puddle, of the reflection. And the trick here is simply that once I made the photograph and I developed the raw file, all I did was flip the picture upside down. And by flipping the picture upside down, I'm changing the viewpoint of this particular picture. I'm changing the point of view. And this suddenly becomes an abstraction. You look at it and you really have a hard time figuring out what exactly is happening here. It's interesting because of the color and the texture of the picture and the dark tones, but how the picture came together isn't quite clear or obvious to a common viewer. So now we're going to shift gears just a little bit and talk about something else that's a little bit more about equipment and how your choice of equipment, and in this case, how your choice of lens actually affects the appearance of your photographs. So the important thing here to understand is something called focal length. Now, focal length refers to the angle of view that your lens sees. Now, every lens has a numbered focal length that's stamped right on the lens, so this is easy to find. Lenses that have a focal length that has a number that's greater than 35 millimeter are called telephoto lenses. Telephoto lenses see a narrow field of view. Telephoto lenses appear to magnify or bring objects closer to the camera. Visually, or I should say probably creatively, a telephoto lens, while magnifying objects, also compresses the background and foreground of a picture and makes it simple to throw the background out of focus. So what it appears to do is pull the background and foreground of a picture closer together. That's a property of the lens. Telephoto lenses are the ideal choice for portraiture, and portrait photographers choose telephoto lenses as their first choice for making a flattering picture of people, and we'll show you examples of that. So telephoto lens, we have a person standing in the foreground. She's about 5'4", and in the background is a rock formation that is 300 or 400 feet tall. And there's great distance between the person and the rock formation in the background, but because of the choice of a telephoto lens, the flattening perspective or the compression of perspective brings those two very different sized and the distance between these two objects much, much closer together. So it flattens the picture and compresses the perspective in this picture. This is the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and the distance that we're looking at here is easily 10 miles. But because of the properties of the telephoto lens, you can see that all of those different rock formations that are in reality spaced very far apart are actually pushed together visually because of the flattening or compression effect of a telephoto lens. And I'll show you why I think this picture is really not terribly successful. If you look in the upper right corner, you will see the reason why I took the picture, which is the bird that's flying through the scene. And if I had just captured this shot a split second sooner, the bird would have appeared against the bright part of the rocks, and you would have seen the bird, and you would have said, okay, so there we go, we have the subject of the picture, and we have this beautiful background. But because the bird had flown into the shadow area on the rocks, you don't even see the bird unless you look very hard. And for that reason alone, the picture is probably, it may be a good example of compression of perspective with a telephoto lens, but as a finished photograph, it's not a terribly good example because of that. These buildings in Delft in Holland, once again, the building in the lower part of the frame is much closer to the camera than the huge cathedral in the background. But because of a telephoto lens, I've been able to compress the two planes. So the near plane, which is the low building with the tiled roof, becomes much closer to this tall cathedral, and it just creates a flattening perspective once again. That's what a telephoto lens is designed to do. Here's a group picture of some of our students, and you'll notice that with a telephoto lens, there's a flatness to the entire image. Now, there isn't a lot of depth between the people in the picture and the background, but there's just a very pleasing, flat, strong perspective in this picture that the telephoto lens lends to this shot. And we'll show you an example of the opposite of this in just a bit. Classic portraiture using a telephoto lens. The idea being, once again, if you think of the rule of thirds here, remember we say we place the eyes in the upper third of the picture, and this is how we fill the frame with a picture of a person. And because the background is so much further away from the subject of this picture, the background goes way out of focus, but it appears to be pushed up right behind the subject. So you've got that flatness again, you've got that compression that makes a very beautiful and kind of typical portrait. This is a professional trick that every portrait photographer knows how to do. It's very, very simple. It starts with just the choice of the lens. Same thing here. Look at how beautifully the background, which is very bright, and the light is coming from behind the little baby in this picture, but look at how beautifully the background goes out of focus, and all of the emphasis goes on the sharp part of the picture. This is a great example also of how your eye goes to the sharpest part of the picture. Pretty typical studio portrait. Now the flatness, this is also shot with a telephoto lens, and the flatness or the compression that we talk about in a picture like this is simply the space or the distance from the tip of this gentleman's nose to his ear. And if you flatten that space, believe it or not, if you flatten that distance, the perspective on the face looks natural. If you do the opposite, if you exaggerate that distance, if you stretch that distance using a different type of lens, you create a more comical or a more distorted view. So this is where we're going to talk about wide-angle lenses. That's the next part of this. So portrait photographers, for flattering photographs or flattering pictures of people, telephoto lenses are a great first choice. Now, when we talk about focal lengths or lenses that have focal lengths that are wider than, or that are less than 35 millimeter, we're talking about wide-angle lenses. Now, wide-angle lenses obviously see a wider field of view. Wide-angle lenses appear to make everything seem further away from the camera. Visually, a wide-angle lens expands the distance between the background and the foreground of a picture. So remember, a telephoto lens compresses that distance. A wide-angle lens does the opposite. It expands that distance. Creatively, wide-angle lenses allow you to make something close to the camera larger, or appear larger, I should say, than things further away. Wide-angle lenses make it simple to keep everything in the foreground and background in focus, which is, once again, the opposite of a telephoto lens, which makes it simple to make the background out of focus and the foreground in sharp focus. So the two types of lenses work exactly opposite from each other. Wide-angle lens, you see the apparent, the stretching of perspective, where the person on the left side of the frame is so much larger than he would be if he was just a few feet further into the picture. The closer that person is to the lens, the larger they appear, the more depth there is in the picture as a result of it. So when you think of wide-angle lenses, think about obviously the expanse from side to side. You can see a lot more from side to side, but like in a picture like this, you can also see that things that are closer to the camera or closer to the lens appear much larger than things that are just a little bit further away, like these buildings. That's a typical street sign, and that's also behind it is a 6 or 7 story building. But the street sign seems so much larger because the wide-angle lens distorts or exaggerates the size of things that are closer to the lens. Here's a picture of a person. Now, this isn't exactly a portrait of a person, and it's not a very close picture of a person, so the wide-angle lens is used carefully here to not distort the person's features, but it does show the person in a little bit more context, a little bit more of his surroundings. So wide-angle lenses are great choices for what we call environmental portraiture, where you want to show a person in an environment, in a scene. So you see the person as well as what's around the person. And if you do it carefully, you don't really distort the person's appearance. If you get too close, you'll distort the person's appearance. This is in Death Valley, once again, in California, and these are salt flats, or they're not actually very flat. You see these huge rock salt formations in the foreground appear to be very large, and in reality they're a foot or two tall, but in the background is this beautiful range of mountains in the background. But you see the distortion between the near object and the far object, the exaggerated distance. Notre Dame in Paris, spectacular building to go into. It's very difficult to figure out how to photograph it because it's just so spectacular. Once again, this is one of those pictures that's more about the reaction to seeing Notre Dame that it is Notre Dame itself. So the people in the foreground are marveling over how beautiful the building is, and by taking a step back and using a wide-angle lens and pointing the camera up, you get a sense of what it's like to actually look at Notre Dame. The wide-angle lens helps distort or exaggerate shapes in space like this. The cloud formation and the way the light is bouncing off of this building, the wide-angle lens includes all of that in the frame and allows you to really play with these exaggerated and kind of impressionistic types of scenes. And here's another great example of what a wide-angle lens does with distorting the size of things. This gentleman is about 6 feet tall, and the building behind him is 7 stories tall. And if you use the wide-angle lens correctly, get down low, get fairly close to the person, you can actually make this gentleman look like he's almost as tall as a 6-story building. And the rock formation in the background here in Sedona, Arizona, is roughly 300, 400 feet tall, and the boulder in the foreground is probably no more than 6 or 7 feet tall. And obviously the runner that's running through the scene in the background is the little bonus feature in this picture. But once again, it just shows how you can play with people's perception of size and distance. And as a group shot, just like in the previous shot we showed you of a class of photographers, here's another class, and we chose to do their class portrait with a wide-angle lens and emphasizing the most vivacious student in the class, leaning very close to the camera in the foreground, and the rest of the class just a couple of feet behind her, but you can already see that just by moving a little bit closer to the camera with a very wide-angle lens, you really distort the size of the folks in the frame. And it makes it a little bit more dynamic and a little more engaging portrait of this group of students. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about in this presentation is something called moment, and this is really where it all starts to come together. We've given you a lot of tools here and a lot of tricks and a lot of techniques and a lot of guidelines to how to understand how to organize the content of your pictures to help make the pictures look more interesting. And the last part of this, the part that makes it all come together, is what we call moment. And moment is about knowing when to take the picture. It's about capturing the peak of the action or emotion, the perfect expression, gesture, etc. And the great photojournalist Henri Cartier-Bresson coined the term the decisive moment to emphasize its importance. So the rest of these pictures today, or in this presentation, are going to show you what we're talking about. We're talking about when to push the button, when to take the picture. Moment. The camera is inside a shop window, and we're just photographing people as they walk past the front of the shop and trying to time the shot to capture the gestures and capture the spirit of these people that are walking past. Moment. This is a windmill in Holland, and the sail of the windmill was moving very, very fast, and we were trying to time the shot so that the sail kind of fell in front of the sun for one of these photographs, and the sun was diffused through the panels on the sail, and this is all about moment. Moment. A rainy night outside of Boston, waiting for the train. The train comes in, a long exposure exaggerates the line of the lights of the train, and in the background are people waiting under an umbrella. There's a real sense of the atmosphere that night. Moment. Just the right person moving at just the right speed on a side street in Holland, and being aware of positive and negative space. The woman on the scooter, obviously the positive space. The background, the dark part of the window in the background, the negative space. And trying to time the shot, release the shutter at just the right point so that she appears against that simple, dark background and not further into the frame where the more confusing part of the frame would actually break up the clarity of this picture. Moment, the right expression. That right gesture, that one point that the speaker is trying to make, all captured in the correct moment. Moment, a performance on stage. A longer moment, hoping that this guy would hold still for 5 seconds for the exposure. The camera was sitting on a table, and just hoping that he just would hold still so that the barrenness of this scene would be able to be recorded. A moment in a studio. This is a product photograph in a studio, how to shoot glassware and how to shoot dynamic content in the studio. The splash, dropping a strawberry into a martini glass, and it's all about timing the release of the shutter to actually capture the peak of the movement in this picture. Kind of a lonely moment recorded by a shadow instead of the person themselves. You record their shadow and it becomes even more anonymous and maybe even a little lonelier. One of my favorite moment pictures. These two beings sharing a moment together. Here's a moment for you. So finally, what we want you to do with all of this is we want you to make better pictures and organize your work, but we also want you to have fun. So I wanted to leave you with this photograph to remind you that the point of all of this is to have fun and to enjoy your increased understanding and appreciation of photography and how simple it is actually to control the impact of your photographs. So I hope this has been very helpful.